Hi and welcome to The Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, an Assistant Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle.
Hi Caroline.
A lot has happened this week.
It certainly has.
And it's just, breaking news all over the place. But look, key things that happened prior to this morning. We had the last parliamentary sitting before the winter break. We had some industrial scale branch stacking revealed in the Victorian ALP. And the Prime Minister and the Labor leader both made speeches to the Committee for Economic Development for Australia, CEDA. Then we got bad news about unemployment figures and there's a shake-up of university degrees. But before we get to any of that, so this morning the Prime Minister has come out to tell the nation about a major cyber attack that Australia is experiencing. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, he called a news conference early this morning to say that there is an attack, or attacks really, multiple attacks that cover the government sector, but also private businesses, parties, political parties, everywhere it seems. He says that this has been going on for some time, but apparently it has in recent times escalated. He's saying that it's a state-based actor responsible. He won't name names, perhaps not surprisingly. People will point the finger to China, but as I stress, he is not saying China. But he is indicating the seriousness with which the government is taking this and saying that Australian authorities are among the best in the world, if not the best in the world, at dealing with this sort of problem. But it's obviously an ongoing problem and one that is very compromising for our systems.
But why today? I mean, as you say, he's revealed that this has been going on for some months now. Why do you think he chose today to tell the country about it?
I don't know why today. I think obviously it's come to some sort of head, but there's no obvious reason as to why today. And it did seem as though he was rearranging his schedule, so it does seem to have been a reasonably late decision to say this today.
So on a related topic, the Foreign Minister Marise Payne this week did make a speech where she was raising concerns about disinformation, now specifically in relation to China, and we don't know whether or not China is the state actor involved in this
state-based actor.
State-based actor in this latest cyber attack. But she was particularly condemning China's claims that students would face racist attacks were they to come to Australia. Gosh, I mean, it's getting more and more complex, isn't it? But is it useful prodding the China bear at the moment in relation to these disinformation claims?
China experts, diplomatic experts disagree about this. Some people say, well, it's no good exacerbating these very deep tensions that exist in the relationship. Others say, well, we've got to push back when claims are made. The government is obviously very concerned that the potential students are not deterred by an exaggeration of problems that they'd face in Australia. Of course, there have been some incidents, some targeting of Chinese people in the coronavirus situation, but they're limited, and the government is sending a strong message before this speech and in this speech that students, when they can get back here, are welcome, and that any particular incidents, Marise Payne said, would be dealt with by the authorities, by the police.
In other education-related news, the Federal Education Minister, Dan Tehan, has announced a bit of a shake-up to university degrees, lowering the cost for degrees that lead to higher employment opportunities and increasing the cost of humanities subjects What's behind this?
Well, just on the content, if you want to go into nursing or teaching and a number of other professions that have jobs growth in prospect, you will be paying less than you would have before. And if you want to study philosophy, well, maybe take a third extra job to pay your way through, because there's going to be a big hike in humanities fees. What's behind it? A couple of things, I think. One is that Scott Morrison is totally focused on jobs. You remember when he said the National Cabinet would be kept in place post-virus, it was all about jobs. That was its primary focus for items to come over the coming months. And I think that the university change reflects that job focus. It's support the training of people in areas where jobs are going to increase. The other part of this, I think, is that there is a certain strand of anti-intellectualism in the coalition, of criticism of universities. I hesitate to say hostility to universities, but certainly criticism of their what is the coalition sees as their more leftist orientation, they believe. And I think that the move against humanities perhaps is part of that, reflects that sort of attitude. They don't value those courses as much as the more practical oriented courses.
It does smack of a bit of a culture war, and you know, funding for research in the humanities is lower than in other areas, though the federal government did try to correct that with some humanities special funding this year. But on top of the government's refusal to extend JobKeeper to universities, what sort of impact do you think this is going to have on the relationship between the university sector and the government?
I think it's a bit early to tell that, but I think it'll depend on the university's overall funding position. Now, obviously the government wants this shake-up of student fees to equal out. It doesn't want to put more money into the system through this change. But the universities, of course, are feeling very squeezed at the moment because the whole virus episode has meant that they're losing a lot of revenue, and even though they're now trying to find ways to get students back in the next few months, special quarantine arrangements and so on, it's going to take a long time to rebuild that market. And of course we've got the China problem as well that we were talking about before, so China might be discouraging people from coming, and the objective circumstances may be making it harder for people to come.
Okay, so trying to boost the economy generally obviously is the main game at the moment, and Scott Morrison's speech to CEDA this week, he made a commitment to reducing red tape and green tape for infrastructure projects to get the economy moving. What are the pros and cons of such an approach of trying to slash red and green tape like this?
Well, it's controversial, especially in the environment area and or environmental approvals, and the coalition always wants to move faster, and the environment groups want to be more cautious, naturally enough. I think that it is sensible to, where you can, have as much liaison between federal and state governments to make sure that things aren't duplicated and that projects are dealt with in a timely fashion without corners being cut. And really you have to look at the detail of the processes to know where that balance is properly struck, and different interests will strike it in different places. But the deregulation agenda extends much more widely than this. Scott Morrison was giving all sorts of examples of how in the pandemic you had a number of health decisions, for example, made in a different way, that people got back into nursing without too much quibbling about whether the qualifications were due process, up to date, etc., that drug trials were enabled to go ahead faster. Now, all this is understandable and desirable in a crisis, but you can't necessarily change the whole regulatory system in for normal times and say, well, what we did then is fine for what we do in the future. So I think it has to proceed on a case-by-case basis, and you just see, as an example, the problems that have arisen with the building of apartments recently, and buildings becoming totally unsafe, people's lives and their money lost, lives disrupted. And in that industry, in New South Wales in particular, they've said, well, we need more regulation. So it really is a quite complicated argument that I think there's a danger that the government tries to oversimplify it.
Also, these are areas that are areas of state control.
Yes, but the government is, I think, talking about trying to get a broader federal state approach. Remember the National Cabinet. So its ambitions are quite wide.
All right, now we've seen the bad news this week about an increase in the unemployment rate from 6.4% in April to 7.1%, and the Prime Minister described the figures, the human face of these figures as devastating, as heartbreaking. How achievable is his goal of a snapback now, on the back of these figures?
Well, to put the percentages into numbers, over the last couple of months, well over 800,000 jobs have been lost. And that's many, many jobs. In terms of the snapback, I think that I'm not sure they actually ever meant that the economy would suddenly snap back. The original quote on that was a little different, I think. But in terms of getting the economy back relatively quickly, it's at the moment an open question how long it will take. But Scott Morrison is really talking about a quite long-term program. He's talking about 3 to 5 years rebuilding. So I don't think he sees any dramatic recovery, but he wants to get a recovery that is as fast as possible in the short term, and then that rebuilds in a more broad way over years, not months.
Okay, so some of the attention this week would have been diverted from these economic concerns by the ALP branch stacking scandal in the Victorian ALP. How well has the Labor Party dealt with this?
Well, the first thing to be said about it is that those who say, shock horror, I never noticed this, who are in the ALP, shouldn't be believed. Everyone knew that this Victorian power broker was running the joint and running the right wing of it anyway, and that this was based on extensive branch stacking. But they just thought, well, don't stir up that hornet's nest, or this is what happens in parties. And of course, when it all was on television, they realised that most people would think this is pretty bad. But the interesting thing about this, they cleaned out the cabinet ministers, Victorian cabinet ministers who were involved pretty quickly. But the interesting thing was that quite a deal of this was filmed in the office of Anthony Byrne, yes, who's a federal Labor member from Victoria and who's deputy chair of the very important Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, which gives him a higher and a distinct profile from an ordinary backbencher. Now, he's staying mum on how it all happened, what his involvement was. The excuse is that the authorities are investigating, but there are many unanswered questions, and I think that the whole thing has a long way to run, and of course it's running during the Eden Monero by-election, which just adds to Anthony Albanese's troubles, which we've canvassed before.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it couldn't be happening at a worse time, really, for the Labor Party. How has Anthony Albanese responded to this? Has it been adequate?
He supported and drove with Daniel Andrews' federal intervention in Victoria, so that whole branch has been handed over to former Premier Steve Bracks, former Minister Jenny Macklin, and he's spoken out strongly against what's happened. He has got a good record himself on arguing that the Labor Party should be clean. So, you know, he doesn't come to this with a involvement of as a stacker or a supporter of stacking in the past. However, I think he tried to really say, well, this is all being fixed. We move on to the positive, that we've done things about this, and that he somehow wanted to keep away from the detail. Now, for days he said he hadn't even talked to Anthony Byrne because investigations were underway about authorities, and you couldn't talk to someone, you know, who was cooperating with the authorities. But by Thursday, when some pretty lurid texts were released to discredit Byrne, or try to discredit him, because he'd been the sort of hero in this before, Anthony Albanese said, well, I've counselled him about his language. The ALP often gets more concerned about the language than the substance of matters. But
well, anyone who's worked in politics, and I assume either side of the aisle, would be familiar with bad language. It seems to, you know, come hand in hand with working in politics, in my experience.
Well, the real world is probably a bit shocked, but as one journalist remarked yesterday, everyone around here talks like that.
Indeed. Look, thanks, Michelle, and we'll explore all of this further next week.
Thanks a lot.